Well, good afternoon. This is going to be, I believe, just a short video talking about some of the interesting astrology behind Biden's very fiery State of the Union address the other night. So let's see if I can share my screen. And I just need to get rid of a few things here so I can see what I'm doing. So just bear with me for a few seconds. Okay, I think we're ready to go. America, Biden, Trump, and the fiery State of the Union address. Now, first of all, the chart that I prefer to use for the United States of America is the July 2nd, 1776 chart for the passage of the resolution for independence. But most of what I say here is going to apply to other July 1776 charts for America as well. It's only when I talk maybe about something conjunct the ascendant over here that applies to this chart in particular. I'll also point out that for some countries like America, I think there are several relevant charts or horoscopes you can look at because the creation of America did not happen in a single moment. It was a process. Uh, Passing a resolution for independence, fighting for independence, uh, having a constitutional convention, constructing the form of government that we have today. Those were all important steps in the creation of America. And so all of these different charts can very well apply. I just simply have a reference to the July 2nd chart, even though I think there are many situations where the July 4th chart works quite well. Okay, now the one thing I really want to point out in this chart for America, and this applies again to all the July 1776 charts, is this opposition we have between Saturn and Chiron. Whenever you have an opposition in a chart, it represents two drives that are trying to integrate their functions together. Two things on opposite sides that are trying to merge. So, what does Saturn represent? Well, it's our drive to control and regulate ourselves. And that is very necessary. We need a certain amount of discipline in order to function and work in a coordinated manner. Uh, Too much uh, regulation, and we feel very restricted and depressed, but just the right amount. And it gives us the freedom which a disciplined athlete or a disciplined dancer has. Now, Chiron over here is often associated with wounding, but as I like to point out every time I talk about Chiron, it makes no sense for us to have a drive to wound ourselves. Instead, I note that Chiron orbits in between Saturn and Uranus, sometimes going inside the orbit of Saturn and sometimes outside the orbit of Uranus. And as such, it functions as a bridge between the visible and the invisible, between what is immediately apparent to our eyes, what's right in front of us, and what is beyond this world that we see. Thus, Chiron, what it really is, it's a drive towards transcendence. It's a drive that says to us, there's something beyond what you're seeing, and you need to go out there and find it, to go boldly go where no one has gone before. That is what Chiron urges us to do. Unfortunately, in the process, it often has to crack that hard Saturnian shell we've erected around ourselves, and that's where the wounding comes in. And as I frequently say, you can't make a cosmic omelet without sometimes breaking a few cosmic eggs. Okay, so that's the way Chiron is. But the sweet side of Chiron, when it's functioning well, it brings in this higher, more transcendent kind of energy. And there's a lot of astrologers who speculate that maybe Chiron is the real ruler of Virgo, since Virgo has some connection with healing, and Chiron also is connected with wounding and healing. But other astrologers, in the years following the discovery of Chiron in the late 70s, there were some who thought that perhaps it ruled Sagittarius. In many ways, that seems very natural because the planet Chiron was named after the centaur Chiron, and that centaur is one of the visual symbols for Sagittarius. In my personal opinion, I think that Chiron is a higher octave of Jupiter. Jupiter is a drive to grow and expand, and Chiron takes us even further, urges us to grow and expand beyond the visible into the invisible. And so I see Jupiter and Chiron both as co-rulers of Sagittarius. Chiron just brings in more of this higher spiritual quality and balance uh, into our lives. Okay, now with Saturn in Libra, opposite Chiron in Aries, well, here's how they can function individually. Libra has to do with relationships. With Saturn in Libra, that gives us a tendency to try to control other countries. And we have certainly done that quite a bit throughout our history. And it's not necessarily a good thing to always try and control and regulate others so much. Chiron and Aries, on the other hand, this represents uh, the higher spiritual quality of Chiron being coupled with the individuality of Aries. So this is individual spirituality, individual holiness in a sense. And we see this reflected in the words uh, that all men are created equal. And of course, we should modify that today and say all people are created equal. It's because of Chiron and Aries that we as a nation recognize the spiritual worth and dignity of all people. And when you have an opposition between Saturn and Chiron, you're trying to integrate this sense of individual spirituality and higher purpose into the very structure of the nation. Saturn also represents concrete structures here. Okay, so this does function in America. It does function sometimes in its higher sense. And we see this reflected in our sense of a mission to sort of spread a higher good around the world, whether it's through democracy or the charity that we participate in and helping other nations. You know, that is this opposition functioning at its best with Saturn and Chiron integrating somewhat. Okay, and we see a lot of that in America's history. But uh, when these two drives don't integrate, we see the nation trying to control others, whether it's other nations abroad or an enslaved population at home. Okay, so anyway, for what I want to talk about today, this particular opposition in America's chart, it's going to be important. Okay, let's move on. And next we have Joe Biden's chart. I just want to point out a few highlights here. First, notice he has Sagittarius rising. Okay. This describes the Joe Biden I've seen throughout most of my life as the public political figure, someone who's very jovial, progressive, has an expanded view of the world. Jupiter, by the way, is in Cancer, which is concerned with families and security. It's in the eighth house, which we usually immediately describe as the house of death and transformation. That sounds pretty ominous, but it's also the house of other people's money and resources. And the connection between those two is uh, this house, if you get married, this house represents the resources of that partnership. And when you get married, the individual ego has to die, the I has to die so that the we can flourish, the partnership can flourish. Okay, well, be that as it may, in Joe Biden's political life, we've seen lots of concern for families and for their well being and for them getting the resources that they need. Okay, so this is the aspect of Biden's personality that I have seen most often throughout the years. Now, he also has Moon and Taurus in the fifth house. With Moon and Taurus, he tends to be very steady, uh, occasionally slow to change. He's not completely stubborn or fixed. He's got, for example, Sagittarius rising. That's a mutable sign. It's very flexible, but there are going to be parts of his personality which are sort of slow and steady, if you will. And the moon is in the fifth house, which has to do with personal creativity and recreation. So he probably enjoys, doing things with his family, engaging in a lot of recreation, but also uh, things which can be avenues for personal creativity and inspiration in his life. Those will also be important. Okay, here is the part of Biden's personality I did not see until he became president. He's actually a Scorpio, and Scorpios are not jovial the way people with Sun and Sagittarius are. He's got Sun, Venus, and Mercury all conjunct here in Scorpio, and he has the Mars in Scorpio also. It's further away from this conjunction, and all of this is in the 12th house. Now, things in the 12th house, they tend to be hidden out of view. And what's being hidden is that Scorpio personality. And part of the nature of Scorpio is it's very strong. It has power. Uh, it can be a leader uh, among people. And it has very strong feelings and emotions about things. And this is a side I did not see until he became president. I did not realize until he assumed the presidency just how powerful and strong a leader he can be. Okay, now a couple of more interesting things. Uh, he has Uranus in Gemini. That is an opposition to his Sun, Venus, and ascendant over here. And Uranus, it always breaks up the existing pattern. Okay, it it's very creative, but breaks up the existing pattern, and it's a planet that can be very manic. To dislodge patterns, that takes a certain amount of energy. And note that Uranus, not only is it in Gemini, but it rules Aquarius, which is on the cusp of his third house. Both the third house and the sign Gemini, which is the third sign in the zodiac, they both have a connection with communication. And what has happened in Biden's case? Again, I didn't really learn about this until after he became president, but he's been a lifelong stutterer. That is why he makes so many gaffes, trips over his words so often. It's because his brain is going too fast. His brain is going so fast, the rest of him can't keep up with it. And so he makes these verbal gaffes or stutters from time to time, even to this day, though it's not, as I understand it, nearly so bad as when he was growing up. Okay. And another thing here is notice that Uranus is conjunct the cusp of the seventh house. Saturn is in the seventh house, not all that far from the cusp. And the seventh house has to do with relationships, partnerships, and in general, and marriage in particular. And what has happened? Well, he has experienced sudden changes in his marital status and great restriction and sorrow in marriage in his earlier years when his uh, wife and one of his children died in a car accident. So Biden has been through a lot of adversity. He went through adversity early on in life, and as an individual, I feel like he learned from that adversity. He learned how to deal with trauma and reversals in life. And as a result, now in his old age, whenever something negatively is impacting Biden's horoscope, it's really hard for me to predict what will happen because he is very good at turning astrological lemons into lemonade. He's a very highly evolved, mature individual who is able to roll with the punches and reverse a downside into an upside. Okay. And here is one other thing which is going to be relevant to his fiery State of the Union address that we're going to get to that. If we look at Chiron in his birth chart, one is conjunct this lunar nodal axis. That's going to intensify it. It's in the ninth house, which has to do with religion, law, and higher education. And those are all interests of Joe Biden. And there's a direct connection, I think, between uh, law and higher spirituality. I'm thinking of, at this moment, of in the Torah. In one of the books of the Torah, the Israelites say, what other nation has such laws as we have? They saw their system of justice as presented in the Torah as being very spiritual, very sublime. And law at its best is that way. It's like, this higher form of logic and understanding of what the balance should be in human life, what should be considered right and what should be considered wrong. So this is a sense that is very strong in Biden. He sees some of these higher spiritual perspectives. He sees the law as it should be, not as a tool for manipulating situations in order to get what you want, but as a tool for benefiting everyone and bringing everyone to a higher, more spiritual place. And notice that Chiron is making a trine to his moon. And the moon, it makes a trine to the north node and to Chiron, and then a sextile to the south node. So In Biden's personality, you're going to see reflected these higher aspects of Chiron, the sweeter side of Chiron, this transcendent spirituality and understanding, as opposed to the wounding that a lot of people experience with Chiron. Okay, let me take a quick sip of water here. If we look at how Biden's chart, which is on the outside here, interacts with the USA chart, which is on the inside. Again, I'm using the July 2nd chart, but this is going to apply to all the July 1776 charts. As we go from one to the other, not much changes except for the position of the moon and rising sign, midheaven, the cusps of the houses. But anyway, what I want to point out here is you have kind of a wide trine between Biden's natal Chiron at 28 plus degrees of Leo and the USA Chiron at 20 plus degrees of Aries. Some would say it's just out of orb. Be that as it may, they're going to be trine by sign. They're both in fire signs here. And so there is a pathway here, an avenue for Biden's higher spirituality to harmonize with the higher ideals of America. And since it makes a trine with a wide orb to natal Chiron over here, it's going to be sextile, at least by sign, to the other pole of this Saturn Chiron opposition, to Saturn in Libra. Now, actually, Biden's Chiron and Saturn, the USA chart, they're about 14 degrees apart, which normally we would consider out of orb. But the fact that it just manages to probably weakly be an orb here in this trine, and then Chiron is involved in the opposition, Saturn, it gets drawn into this a bit, I do believe. And at the very least, they're going to be all be trine and sextile by sign. So the bottom line is that Joe Biden's sense of higher spirituality and justice, it harmonizes with these elements in the chart for America. And he is a person who can bring to America that particular gift, this higher vision of how things ought to be. I'm thinking now of the Kerrville Folk Festival, which I think it's still going on back in Texas, once a year in Kerrville, Texas. And I think it started back in the 70s, and I've been a few times. And it's just, when I went, it is a wonderful gathering. And every time you go into that festival, there's a sign there that says, it can always be this way. When you enter into that festival, it's like entering into a better version of life on earth, where everyone is living in peace and harmony with everyone else. So that's what Biden brings or awakens in America's own chart, this higher sense of beauty and harmony and justice. Okay, and now let's move on to Donald Trump's chart for a minute. I just want to point out a few things here. And this is one of them. Notice he has his sun in Gemini, is conjunct Uranus, and both are conjunct the north node of the moon. And that means it's in opposition to the south node. It's also in opposition to the moon. And Trump was born just a few hours before a lunar eclipse. So he's basically an eclipse baby. What does this do? Well, whatever Sun and Uranus means, the lunar nodal axis, it's intensifying that. Now, I've mentioned already that Uranus breaks up the existing pattern, and it's a very hyper planet. It tends to overstimulate things in its effort to get us to be creative and break up the existing pattern. Uh, it's in Gemini. Sun and Uranus are in Gemini, so that's the mind, which gets very stimulated. At its best, this would make Trump a highly creative person. At its worst, it makes him just uh, a babbling monkey, a mind that can't sit still, that just bounces from one thing to another with no rhyme, reason, or logic. Now, if you're a supporter of Trump, you'll see him in the former way as someone highly creative. If you're not so enamored with Trump and his politics, you're just going to see just a meaningless, babbling stream of consciousness that comes out of him. The fact that Sun and Uranus are conjunct the north node of the moon, uh, that has a tendency to magnify these tendencies. And with these planets in the 10th house, it creates this insatiable desire for power. And we see a lot of that. Okay, let me move on now to the next slide. There's a lot we could talk about in Trump's chart, but I'm only going to mention a few characteristics here. But this one is also very evident. Uh, he has Leo rising. That puts an emphasis on just the self. And at its most extreme, it's a person who sees the self only uh, and not others. The most extreme version of Leo would have trouble empathizing with others. And with Mars strongly conjunct the ascendant, this could make him a very physically active person, a very assertive person, also a very aggressive person, and a very angry person. Okay, so I've pointed out some of the positives and some of the negatives. Those of you who are Trump supporters will tend to see him in the light of the positive expressions of Mars conjunctus Leo ascendant. Those who are not supporters of his will tend to see him the more negative aspects of Mars conjunct a Leo ascendant, those negative aspects as being more evident in him. Okay, now let's see. I want to point out a couple of things about how his chart interacts with the chart for America. So I've got that July 2nd chart on the inside, Trump's chart on the outside. And look at this. He has Neptune strongly conjunct this Libra ascendant in the USA chart. This explains why he is able to mesmerize so many people, why he can break down their barriers and exert such a hypnotic influence on his followers. And here's another thing worth noting. In the USA chart, Saturn is at 14 plus degrees of Libra. Trump's Chiron is at 14 plus degrees of Libra. Now, if we think of Saturn as representing structure, in particular, the structure of our democracy and our country, if you think of Chiron as being associated with wounding, then for myself, I know of no one who has wounded the structure of our democracy in my lifetime more than Donald Trump. However, again, if you're a Trump supporter, you're going to see this as a positive instead of a negative. And you would look at this and say, well, what he's really doing is he's draining the swamp, right? He is tearing down those structures that need to be torn down. Okay, so two different ways of looking at the same thing, depending upon your own political perspective. But either way, we can see how Trump is reflected in these astrological charts and in the interaction of Trump's chart with America's chart. And let's see what else. Oh, look at a Sun, North Node, and Uranus here. Uh, they're all pretty strongly conjunct Mars and the USA chart. If you use the July 4th chart, Mars will have moved on to about 21 degrees of Cancer. We still have that conjunction in effect. And what this is going to do is he can get people worked up. He can get people angry about things, get them to take action, and get them to be very revolutionary, because that is one of the aspects of the planet Uranus. It's often connected with revolutions and revolts. And Sun, North Node, and Uranus, they're also making a pretty strong square to Neptune here. So we see a lot of information originating with Donald Trump. He gets people riled up and he feeds them a lot of disinformation, misinformation, falsehoods about this and that. Okay. So that gives you some context here, some perspective on what's going on in America's chart, that opposition between Saturn and Chiron, which sometimes causes us to wound other people, both in and outside of our nation, wound other countries, but also represents our country's mission to be that shining light to others, that shining city on the hill, that beacon of freedom and democracy, that country which more than any other talks about the individual worth and spirituality of every person. Okay, so we talked about that, talked about Biden's basic orientations, Trump's basic orientations, and how both of them interact in some important ways with America's chart. Okay, now let's take a look at the chart for March 7th, which is when the State of the Union address was delivered. And I set it for 8 p.m. out here in Scottsdale, Arizona. And that was about midway through the State of the Union address. And what's the most important transit we see going on this day? Pretty strong square between Mars and Uranus. This, in a nutshell, is why that speech was so fiery. Or I should say, giving a fiery speech that day was just so in tune with the astrology of the moment, because Mars is very aggressive, very assertive. Uranus, very revolutionary, wants to break up the pattern. And notice this too. Mars is in Aquarius. Aquarius represents group action, the creative power of the group. And with Pluto having recently moved from Capricorn into Aquarius, it represents that transfer of power from individuals to groups, to the people, to collectives. Okay. It also represents other aspects of Aquarius, like humanitarian concerns and new technologies, scientific breakthroughs. Now, Uranus down here is in Taurus, which, among other things, it has to do not just with things we enjoy and like, but with money and finances, resources that we need to survive. And what is one of the things that Biden wants to do? Well, he wants the people with money to pay their fair share in taxes. So this is the power of the people, the collective, that wants these individuals, these ultra wealthy individuals, to pay a larger percentage in taxes. Uh, as he pointed out in the State of the Union speech, most of these billionaires are paying about 8% in taxes. And that is far below the percentage that most of us middle class people are paying annually in taxes. Okay, so Mars was really setting off the revolution, and Biden was on fire that night. Jupiter, conjunct Uranus, and engaging also in this square, it helps expand things, magnify things. And the moon, uh, coming into conjunction with Mars at this moment, the moon is like the trigger. So this was the perfect speech for the moment. It reflected uh, all that perhaps righteous anger, if you will, at things which need to be changed, things which aren't going well, and things which should be changed. Okay, now there were some other aspects, softer aspects that were reflected in that speech. We had also at this time Mercury pretty strongly conjunct Neptune. So we saw these elements of compassion and empathy also in what Biden talked about. Uh, both the Neptune influence and the Aquarian influence, for instance, were reflected in Biden's plan to bring more aid to the starving and wounded people of Gaza. Okay, and this one I think is quite important. Uh, Also on this day, there was a very strong sextile between Mars and Moon up here in Aquarius and Chiron in Aries. And the conjunction Aquarius was making a sextile to this end of the lunar nodal axis and a trine to the other end. And the lunar nodal axis, it always intensifies things. So the sense of higher spirituality and higher justice uh, that we see in Biden's chart, well, this day, it was a perfect day of perfect time to express all of these things. So, just looking just at the transits at this time, uh, we can see from the square here involving Mars and Uranus, that represents the fiery nature and ideas in Biden's State of the Union address. But then we also saw these elements of humanitarianism represented by Aquarius, compassion represented by Mercury conjunct Neptune and Pisces, and this higher spirituality, this higher sense of justice represented by the sextile between Mars, Moon, and Chiron in Aries. Okay, now if we set up a bi-wheel where on the inside we have uh, Joe Biden's chart, on the outside we have the transits that were taking place during this State of the Union address, we see some very interesting things here. Uh, in his natal chart, Joe Biden has a trine between Neptune and Uranus. And when we add in the transit chart, Pluto, transiting Pluto, it's completing a grand trine between these planets. So he has this incredible grand trine involving the three outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. That's a lot of higher, more transcendent energy, which is becoming focused through Joe Biden. And because Pluto moves very slowly, this is going to be an aspect that lasts quite a while throughout this year. It will go away maybe briefly later on in the fall when Pluto goes retrograde, goes back into Capricorn. But it's not going to get very far from this. And I think by mid November, it starts moving direct again, moves back into Aquarius. So this is something very beneficial that will be with Biden throughout most of the year. He's going to be in tune with a higher, more transcendent vibration and way of doing things. Also, note that these planets are all in air signs. Uh, it was in December of 2020, I believe, that we had this very momentous conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Saturn at 0+ degrees Aquarius. Okay. We get these conjunctions once every 20 years. They denote social changes, but this one was particularly important because it was ending about a 250-year cycle of those conjunctions occurring in Earth signs and inaugurating for the next 300 years a cycle of those Jupiter Saturn conjunctions occurring in air signs. And that represents a transition from away from materiality into the realm of ideas, creativity, and relationship. Okay, so again, Joe Biden is very much in tune with the astrology of the times. Let me get one more sip of water here. And that's not the only grand trine that's being completed in his chart. We also have transiting Neptune in Pisces, making a very strong trine to his Sun and Venus, Biden's Sun and Venus in Scorpio, and his natal Jupiter in Cancer. And as with the previous arrangement, this transit by Neptune, it's completing a grand trine. Okay. Notice Mercury is part of it. Mercury moves a lot faster, but it's acting as like a trigger. Just as here, let's see, here in the transit chart, the moon is acting as a trigger for this Mars Uranus square. Okay, so with this grand trine in water signs, well, Mercury's going to move on pretty quickly, but Neptune, it's going to stay here quite a while. So again, this is just more transcendent, higher spiritual energy being funneled through Biden's consciousness. So this will be in effect for a while. And this one is in water signs rather than air signs. Air signs tend to be uh, extroverted and thinking oriented. Water signs tend to be more introverted and feeling oriented. So what this is telling me is not only is Biden getting the right ideas intellectually, he's also has the right feelings and compassion and empathy with the people. He feels their pain. He feels uh, what they are going through. And so those are just two wonderful things that are going on in Biden's chart this year. This grand trine being completed by Pluto, and the second grand trine in water signs being completed by Neptune. And this is what was in effect at the time of that State of the Union address. And so, what the astrology suggested and what was delivered was a very fiery and revolutionary speech, but one that also focused on humanitarian concerns, compassion for others, and this higher sense of justice and spiritual purpose. Okay, if I can put it that way. And that is going to be it for this slideshow. So let me stop sharing. And I'm back. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you got some good things out of it. It's always amazes me, but doesn't surprise me when I look to see how well the astrology often uh, fits like a glove for what is observed in reality. So again, I hope you enjoyed it. Uh, I will say so long and be well, and remember to be kind to others, to give a little bit to charity each month, and uh, I'll end with just a little note from Torah, and I'm recording this on Saturday, and in today's Torah portion, it was all about the construction of the tabernacle in the desert and the Ark of the Covenant. And in the construction, uh, the people were told to everyone just bring whatever gift you have, whatever your heart so moves you to bring. And so different people, each one brought different things to help with the construction of this tabernacle. And the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, this was a holy space being constructed so that this sense of God or higher spirituality can dwell actually within each of us. So, this is what I always like to recommend to people. When you go out into the world, not only be kind, not only give to charity, but think about what your gift is for the rest of humanity. Think about what you can give to help make this world a better place. For rich people, that giving may take place just through money. Uh, for the poorest person, it can just be a smile that you give to someone else on the street. For teachers, it's the knowledge that they share with others. For musicians, it's the beautiful music and the songs that they share. For scientists and mathematicians, it's the ideas uh, that we discover that delight us that we can share with others. Well, regardless of what it is, everyone has something that they can share with the rest of humanity that can help make this world a better place. And when we do that, then the whole earth becomes this tabernacle, this holy place uh, where God can then dwell within each of us and within each of our hearts. So again, I'll stop the recording here. I'll just say so long, be well, and do good things in the world to make this world a holier place. So long.